The courtroom laughed. Not loudly at first. Just a few sharp chuckles from the polished men in tailored suits seated behind my father. Then a low ripple spread through the old Charleston probate chamber, like wind moving across dry leaves. Even the bailiff looked away to hide his smile. My father stood at the plaintiff's table, one hand resting on polished walnut, as though he already owned the room. His silver hair combed perfectly into place, his navy suit pressed so sharply it could have cut paper. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth and practiced, "my daughter can barely pay rent." A few more laughs. The judge leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his stomach. The corners of his mouth curled upward. "And she expects to control a $31 million estate." This time the room laughed openly. My stepmother Linda gave one soft, elegant clap of amusement before covering her mouth as if embarrassed by her own delight. I sat quietly at the defense table in my second-hand gray blazer, hands folded neatly in my lap, my face calm. The judge shook his head. "Well, Miss Whitmore, this ought to be interesting." Then I stood. The sound of my chair scraping across the hardwood floor sliced through the laughter. Every eye in that courtroom shifted to me. I looked directly at the judge and said, "I'm the federally appointed receiver of Whitmore Holdings, effective 8 o'clock this morning." The laughter died so fast it felt stolen. The judge's smile vanished. And for the first time in my father's life, Harold Whitmore looked afraid. 3 hours earlier, I had stood in front of the bathroom mirror of my one-bedroom apartment on Rutledge Avenue and adjusted the sleeves of that same gray blazer. The apartment wasn't much, 600 square feet above an old hardware store downtown. The plumbing rattled when the upstairs neighbor showered, and the kitchen window stuck every summer from the humidity rolling in off Charleston Harbor. But it was clean, paid for, and mine. The coffee maker hissed behind me while morning traffic drifted faintly through the cracked window. I remember looking at myself and thinking how ordinary I appeared. A 46-year-old widow with sensible shoes and faint lines at the corners of her eyes, no diamonds, no designer handbag, no sign of power. That had always made people underestimate me, my father especially. The phone rang at exactly 7:12 a.m. I answered on the second ring. "Miss Whitmore." The voice was clipped and formal. "Yes. This is Thomas Avery with the Federal Trust Oversight Office. I'm calling to confirm activation of the Samuel Whitmore Irrevocable Successor Trust. Appointment authority transferred as of 800 hours. I closed my eyes. Even though I had expected the call, hearing those words made my chest tighten. "It's official." "Yes, ma'am." "And Harold. He has been formally stripped of all discretionary authority pending forensic review." I was silent for a moment, not because I was celebrating, because I could hear my grandfather's voice in my memory. "Money doesn't reveal character, Evelyn. It magnifies it." "Thank you," I said quietly. Then I hung up and poured my coffee. No shaking hands, no tears, just stillness. Granddaddy had prepared me for this years ago. I simply hadn't known when the day would come. I was 12 the first time Samuel Whitmore tested me. The family had gathered at his summer home on Sullivan's Island for one of his elaborate Sunday dinners. My father spent the entire evening bragging to investors about Whitmore Textile's newest acquisition, while Mother smiled politely beside him, already exhausted by his hunger for approval. After dessert, Granddaddy called me into his study. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. He handed me an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000. I stared at it. "There's been a mistake," I said. He smiled. "What makes you think that—" "It's too much. My college fund isn't that large." He leaned back in his chair and watched me carefully. Most children would have celebrated. Maybe hidden it. Maybe spent it in their imagination before the ink dried. I handed it back. "You should tell your accountant." His smile deepened. "That's what I hoped you'd say." Years later, after I was grown, he admitted it had been a test. Not of honesty alone. Of instinct. He believed integrity was often immediate, not calculated. You either reached for what wasn't yours, or you didn't. My father would have kept the check. Granddaddy already knew that. After my mother died when I was 28, everything changed. She had been the one softening Harold's edges. Without her, his ambition sharpened into something colder. Within 18 months, he married Linda Prescott, a woman 20 years younger with perfect posture, polished vowels, and the social instincts of a shark scenting blood. Linda understood quickly that Harold's greatest weakness was insecurity. He had spent his entire life trying to impress a father who valued principle over profit, and Samuel had never fully trusted him. Linda fed that wound. "You built this company into something greater than Samuel ever imagined," she would tell him. You deserve total control. Harold believed her because he needed to. When my husband Michael got sick years later, I left Charleston to care for him in Ohio. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 14 months of hospice nurses whispered prayers at 2 in the morning. I would have done it for 14 years if it meant one more day. But Michael died in February with snow falling softly outside our Cleveland window. After the funeral, I came home broke, widowed, 42 years old and starting over. Father called me weak, said Michael's illness had become my excuse for failure. He offered money once. When I refused, he never offered again. Instead, he told anyone who asked that I had squandered my inheritance, that I lacked discipline, that I had become exactly what happens when people are given too much and expected too little. He said it so often Charleston society accepted it as fact. It became my reputation. Poor Evelyn. Couldn't manage life. Could barely pay rent. Which, to be fair, had occasionally been true. But while Father was telling those stories over cocktails at the Carolina Yacht Club, I was rebuilding quietly, working part-time at the Charleston Public Library, studying estate law at night, volunteering with a nonprofit that investigated elder financial abuse, learning how greed leaves fingerprints, learning how pride always overplays its hand, and all the while Granddaddy's sealed trust waited, silent, patient, until Harold made his move. Last month, he filed probate action to consolidate full ownership of Whitmore Holdings under his sole authority. That filing triggered everything, exactly as Samuel designed. And now here we were, in court. My father smiling, the judge smirking, the room laughing, none of them understanding that the world they thought Harold controlled had already shifted beneath their feet. As I stood before that courtroom and watched the color drain from my father's face, I thought of Granddaddy sitting in his leather chair all those years ago, testing a little girl with a check she could have stolen. He had known something none of us understood then. Character takes years to build, and only one moment to reveal itself. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the federal document in his trembling hand. Then he looked back at me and spoke 5 words that changed everything. Miss Whitmore, explain this immediately. The judge's voice carried across the courtroom like a crack of thunder. Miss Whitmore, explain this immediately. For a moment, no one moved. Not my father. Not Linda. Not the lawyers who had spent the last 40 minutes polishing my humiliation into legal argument. The old Charleston courthouse had gone still in that peculiar southern way, where silence somehow feels louder than shouting. Even the ceiling fan overhead seemed to hesitate. I looked down at the federal trust certification in the judge's trembling hand and felt a strange calm settle over me. This was the moment my grandfather had spent years preparing me for. And somehow standing there in that faded gray blazer with my father's empire hanging in the balance, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. The kind of tired that comes after carrying a truth too heavy for too long. I folded my hands in front of me. My grandfather established the Samuel Whitmore Irrevocable Successor Trust 17 years ago, I said evenly. Across the aisle, Father's jaw tightened. That is absurd, he snapped. The judge lifted a hand sharply. You'll remain silent, Mr. Whitmore. Father obeyed, though his face had gone a dangerous shade of red. I continued. The trust was sealed under federal fiduciary review. It included a dormant succession clause, triggered by any attempt to consolidate Whitmore Holdings through probate manipulation. Linda's face drained of color. She knew exactly what that meant. Harold's filing last month his carefully orchestrated petition to absorb all corporate voting authority into his personal control had activated the clause. He had sprung the trap himself. The judge adjusted his glasses and scanned the page again. His earlier smirk had vanished completely. And you were named successor receiver. Yes, Your Honor. Why? That question landed harder than I expected. Why me? It was the same question my father had spent half my life asking. Why had Samuel trusted his granddaughter more than his only son? Why had the old man looked at me and seen strength where Harold saw weakness? I glanced toward my father. His expression wasn't anger now. It was something closer to confusion. The answer to that question began 40 years earlier. I was 6 years old the first time Granddaddy took me to the textile mill. Most little girls in Charleston spent summer mornings at writing lessons or piano recitals. Not me. Samuel Whitmore believed children learned more from honest work than polite applause. So while Father attended executive breakfasts downtown, Granddaddy brought me to Whitmore Textile Plant No. 3 just outside Somerville. The mill was enormous. Brick walls blackened with age. Massive looms clattering like thunder. The air smelled of cotton dust and machine oil. I remember clutching his hand as we walked the production floor, my tiny fingers swallowed by his broad palm. He stopped every few feet to greet workers by name. Not because he had to, because he knew them. "Morning, Earl. How's your wife feeling? Tell your boy congratulations on the scholarship, Janet. Good to see you back, Miguel. Heard your mother's surgery went well." He remembered everything. Afterward, we sat in his office drinking lemonade from paper cups while he explained the business to me. Not profits, not stock prices, people. "These machines matter because families depend on them," he said. "A company that forgets its people becomes a machine itself. And machines have no conscience." I didn't fully understand then, but I remembered. Years later, Harold forgot that lesson completely. Granddaddy never did. By the time I was 29, Samuel had grown quieter. Age had bent his shoulders slightly, though his mind remained sharp enough to frighten every attorney in Charleston. That was the year he discovered Harold had begun quietly leveraging company assets to finance speculative luxury developments in Florida. High-risk projects, massive debt exposure, no board disclosure, no family approval. When Samuel confronted him, Father denied everything, then blamed modern market realities. "Expansion requires vision," Harold had said. Samuel's answer was simple. "Vision without conscience is appetite." Father stormed out of the house and didn't speak to him for nearly 3 months. That autumn, Samuel called me to his study. I can still picture the room. Dark mahogany shelves, a fire crackling softly despite the October warmth, his bourbon untouched beside his chair. He looked older than I had ever seen him. Not weak, just worn. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "do you know why your father has spent his life resenting me?" I shook my head. He gave a tired smile. "Because he thinks trust is something earned through success." He gestured for me to sit. "But trust isn't awarded for achievement. It's revealed through character." Then he opened a thick legal folder and slid it across the desk. Inside were trust documents, corporate structures, federal escrow certifications. At 29, I barely understood half of it. But I understood enough. "You're naming me." He nodded. "Only if Harold forces my hand." I stared at him. "Why would he?" Granddaddy looked toward the fire. "Because men who hunger for control rarely recognize when enough has become too much." I remember feeling sick. "I don't want this." "That," he said softly, "is precisely why you must have it." I looked up. He met my eyes steadily. "Your father wants ownership because he believes it will finally prove his worth. But ownership never heals insecurity. It only magnifies it." His voice lowered. "If the day comes when this activates, promise me one thing." "What?" "Save the company, not the fortune, the people." I nodded through tears. He smiled then. The same warm, steady smile he'd worn my whole life. "Good girl." He died 6 weeks later. Peacefully. In his sleep. At his funeral, Father cried harder than I had ever seen. But even then, I knew some of those tears came from something deeper than grief. He had lost his last chance to win Samuel's approval. And men can spend their lives chasing what pride will never let them receive. Back in the courtroom, I met the judge's eyes. "That's why he chose me, Your Honor." No one spoke. The old clock on the rear wall ticked softly. Father looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Spiritually. Like a man suddenly realizing he had misunderstood his entire life. "That's impossible," he said hoarsely. He would have told me. I looked at him carefully. No, Father, he wouldn't. The truth hit him harder than any accusation could have. Because deep down, Harold Whitmore already knew it was true. He had always known. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitmore's probate authority is suspended pending immediate forensic review." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Linda grabbed Father's sleeve. "Harold, do something." But he couldn't. For the first time in 74 years, Harold Whitmore had no move left to make. Then the courtroom doors opened, and 3 federal forensic auditors walked inside carrying sealed black cases. The lead investigator approached the bench and spoke words that made Linda audibly gasp. "Your Honor, we've identified substantial evidence of concealed fiduciary misconduct." My father turned toward me slowly. His face had gone ghost white, and in that instant I realized something heartbreaking. He wasn't afraid of prison. He was afraid Granddaddy had been right about him all along. The sound Linda made was small and sharp, like a glass cracking under pressure. Not a scream, not even a gasp, really. Just the involuntary sound of someone realizing the floor beneath them has already given way. My father didn't move. He stood there at the plaintiff's table with his face drained pale beneath the courtroom lights, staring at the 3 federal auditors, as if they had stepped out of some fever dream. The lead investigator, a tall woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, placed a sealed folder on the bench. "Special Auditor Karen Dorsey, Federal Trust Oversight," she said. The judge nodded stiffly. "Proceed." She opened the folder and began laying out document after document with practiced precision. Wire transfers, asset transfers, shell corporation registrations, loan structures, tax filings. The language was dry and technical, but the meaning was devastatingly clear. My father had spent the last 12 years quietly draining Whitmore Holdings through layered corporate entities disguised as growth investments, luxury coastal developments in Florida, speculative resort properties in the Carolinas, private offshore accounts routed through Delaware and Nevada holding companies, millions moved carefully enough to avoid casual scrutiny. Not theft in the crude sense, not envelopes stuffed with cash or dramatic embezzlement. Something worse. The kind of greed that dresses itself in legality and dares anyone to notice. The courtroom sat frozen. Judge Carlisle adjusted his glasses again and again, as though changing the angle might somehow change what he was reading. Linda gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table so tightly her knuckles blanched white. And Harold Whitmore, my father, the man Charleston society had admired for decades, looked suddenly very old. Not distinguished. Not commanding. Just old. Auditor Dorsey's voice remained calm. "Our preliminary findings indicate approximately $11.4 million in concealed liabilities tied to non-disclosed speculative exposure." A murmur swept through the room. 11 million? Even in Charleston, where old money floated quietly behind historic facades and private club memberships, that number landed like an earthquake. The judge looked over his glasses. "Mr. Whitmore, were these liabilities disclosed to your board?" Father swallowed. "Number. Were they disclosed to trust oversight?" Silence. The judge's voice sharpened. "Answer the question. Number?" His voice came out brittle and thin. It was the first time in my life I had ever heard fear crack through Harold Whitmore's confidence. And strangely enough, I felt no satisfaction. Only sadness, because this wasn't the moment he became this man. It was simply the moment everyone else finally saw him clearly. The truth had started revealing itself months earlier. At first, it was just small inconsistencies buried in public financial disclosures. I noticed them one evening at the library while helping archive municipal tax records. Most people imagine libraries as quiet places where nothing important happens. But if you know where to look, every secret eventually leaves paper behind. I had spent years volunteering with Charleston Elder Advocacy Services, helping elderly residents identify financial exploitation by family members and predatory caretakers. The work teaches you something invaluable. Greed always leaves patterns. People think deception is creativity. It isn't. It's repetition. Repeated concealment. Repeated rationalization. Repeated little choices that slowly become a life. That night I was cross-referencing trust property tax filings when one valuation caught my eye. A Hilton Head development listed under a corporate shell I recognized from Whitmore Holdings disclosures. Except the debt structure attached to it made no sense. Too aggressive. Too leveraged. I checked another. Then another. By midnight I had 6 discrepancies. By 2 in the morning I knew exactly what Father was doing. He was mortgaging the company's future to manufacture the illusion of present success. Classic insecurity economics. Dress up risk as vision. Call recklessness innovation. Count applause as proof of wisdom. I sat there beneath the soft yellow reading lamps of the Charleston Public Library and stared at the numbers until my coffee went cold. Then I thought of Granddaddy, of his steady voice. Ownership never heals insecurity. It magnifies it. That was the night I contacted Federal Trust Oversight and formally submitted activation evidence under the Dormant Succession Clause. The process moved quietly, professionally, without drama, which was exactly how Granddaddy designed it. He understood something my father never did. Real power rarely announces itself. It simply arrives when needed. Back in court, Father found his voice. "This is absurd." He pointed at me, his hand trembling. "She orchestrated this." "No," I said quietly. He turned fully toward me. "You've been spying on this family for years. The accusation hung there. Sharp. Ugly. Pathetic." I met his eyes. "No, Father. I was paying attention." The words landed harder than I intended, because they were true in more ways than one. All my life, Harold had mistaken attention for obedience. He believed if I wasn't fighting him, I must be yielding. He never understood that silence often means observation, and observation eventually becomes understanding. Linda suddenly spoke, her voice tight with panic. Harold told me these were temporary restructures. You said everything was protected. Father stared at her. For one raw second, his polished social mask slipped completely, and I saw the frightened little boy Granddaddy once described, the one forever trying to prove he mattered. I was fixing it, he whispered. Linda stepped back as if he'd struck her. That was when I understood she had never loved him. Not really. She loved proximity to power, and now that power was evaporating in real time. She looked around the courtroom, calculating, measuring exits. Social survival often wears expensive perfume. Judge Carlisle struck his gavel. Enough. The room jolted. He looked directly at Father. Harold Whitmore, pending federal review, your control of Whitmore Holdings is hereby suspended effective immediately. Silence. Then the words that truly ended his empire. All discretionary authority transfers to Miss Evelyn Whitmore. A sound escaped Father's throat. Not anger, not protest. Something deeper. The sound of identity collapsing. For 74 years, Harold Whitmore had believed control made him significant. Now control was gone, and he had no idea who remained. The judge turned to me. Miss Whitmore, this court recognizes your authority under federal succession trust law. I nodded once. Steady. Professional. Inside, my heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone might hear it. Then Auditor Dorsey leaned toward the bench and quietly added, Your Honor, there is one further matter requiring immediate attention. The judge frowned. What matter? She opened another folder. The look on her face changed. Not surprise. Not concern. Recognition. As though she had finally reached the worst page in a terrible book. Then she spoke words that made my stomach drop. We've located evidence suggesting Mrs. Linda Whitmore may have participated directly in fraudulent asset concealment. Linda's face went white, and for the first time all morning, she looked at Harold not with loyalty, but with betrayal. If you've lived long enough, you learn there are many kinds of silence. There's the peaceful kind, like dawn settling over Charleston Harbor before the fishing boats begin their engines. There's the lonely kind, the one that fills a house after someone you love has died. And then there's the silence of truth arriving all at once. That was the silence that settled over Judge Carlisle's courtroom when Auditor Dorsey spoke Linda's name. It was so complete I could hear the soft, electric hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Linda Whitmore had spent nearly 20 years moving through Charleston society like polished silver. She chaired hospital galas, hosted Christmas charity auctions in our family's historic South Battery home, remembered everyone's birthdays, every anniversary, every social detail that mattered. Women envied her elegance. Men admired her composure. She knew exactly how to stand, smile, and tilt her head to suggest warmth without ever giving too much away. And now, for the first time since I had known her, that composure shattered. Her lips parted slightly. Her carefully manicured fingers released Harold's sleeve as though touching him had suddenly become dangerous. What did you say? Her voice came out thin and brittle. Auditor Dorsey didn't blink. We have evidence indicating your authorization on multiple concealed transfer approvals tied to Seaview Coastal Development and Marshlight Holdings. Linda's eyes snapped to Harold. For a moment, no one in the courtroom existed but the two of them. And what passed between them in that instant was not love. It was recognition. The terrible kind. The kind people share when they both understand exactly how much they've lied to each other. Harold's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Linda, you told me those signatures were procedural. Her voice was rising now, losing all of its practiced Southern polish. You said those were compliance acknowledgments. His face twitched. Keep your voice down. She laughed. Actually laughed. It was a sharp, unbelieving sound that echoed off the paneled courtroom walls. Keep my voice down. Then she turned to the judge, her eyes bright with panic. He told me these were legal restructures. I signed where counsel instructed. Harold's expression hardened. For the first time all morning, anger returned to him. Not the cool executive displeasure Charleston knew so well. Real anger. The kind men reveal when control slips through their fingers. Careful, he said quietly. Linda stared at him. And in her face, I saw the exact moment she understood something she should have realized years earlier. Harold Whitmore would sacrifice anyone to protect his pride. Even her. Especially her. Judge Carlisle struck his gavel sharply. Enough. Mrs. Whitmore, you will remain available for federal questioning. Linda sank into her chair. Her hands trembled visibly. The woman who had once corrected my posture at dinner parties now looked small and frightened and suddenly very human. And I felt an unexpected flicker of pity. Because I knew what it was like to realize too late that someone you trusted had built your life on illusion. I learned that lesson in Ohio. The winter Michael died was the coldest Cleveland had seen in years. Snow pressed against our apartment windows in heavy drifts, muffling the world outside until everything felt suspended in white silence. Hospice had set up a narrow bed in the living room because Michael wanted to face the window. He said he liked watching the snowfall. Said it reminded him the world could still be beautiful even while disappearing. By then, the cancer had taken most of his strength. His hands, once broad and steady from years repairing machinery, had grown so thin I could feel every bone when I held them. One night, about 3 weeks before he died, he woke just after midnight. The room was dark except for the street lamp glow filtering through the curtains. He looked at me sitting beside him and smiled faintly. "You should go home." I squeezed his hand. "This is home." "No." His voice was weak but certain. "Charleston." I shook my head. "There's nothing there for me." He studied me for a long moment. Then he said something I didn't understand until years later. "You've spent your whole life waiting for your father to see you clearly." I looked away. Even dying Michael could still read me too well. "He never will," he said softly. The truth hurt because I already knew it. Michael's fingers tightened around mine. "Stop building your worth around someone else's blindness." I cried quietly beside his bed while snow drifted past the window. He passed 17 days later with my hand in his. After the funeral, I sat alone in our apartment staring at the empty recliner by the window. Everything was still. And for the first time in my life, I understood something freedom often feels like: grief. Because when illusion finally dies, what remains is painful, but real. That was the lesson Michael gave me, and it saved me. I came home to Charleston with almost nothing. No money, no husband, no clear future. But I also came home with a kind of honesty I had never possessed before. I no longer needed Harold Whitmore's approval to know my own worth. That changed everything. Quietly. Permanently. It was what allowed me to stand in that courtroom now without fear. Not because I had won, because I no longer needed to. Back at counsel table, my father looked at me differently. For years, his eyes had held dismissal, irritation, sometimes embarrassment. Now there was something else. Confusion. As if he had just realized he had been looking at a stranger all along. "How long?" he asked quietly. The room had settled again. Even the reporters in back had stopped scribbling. I met his gaze. "How long what? How long have you been planning this?" There was genuine bewilderment in his voice. He truly believed power worked only one way through scheme's leverage calculation. He couldn't imagine another answer. I shook my head. "I wasn't planning against you, Father." "Then what were you doing?" The question carried something almost childlike. And that was what finally broke my heart. Because Harold Whitmore still didn't understand. I answered gently. I was becoming the person Granddaddy believed I already was. Something in his face shifted. A crack too deep to hide. For one fleeting second, he looked less like the man who had spent decades ruling Charleston boardrooms, and more like a lost boy standing outside his father's locked study door. Judge Carlisle cleared his throat. "Court will recess for 30 minutes while federal counsel prepares immediate asset injunction orders." The gavel struck. People began rising. Chairs scraped. Whispers erupted. The room was alive again. But my father didn't move. He simply stood there, staring at the polished wood of the plaintiff's table, his shoulders slightly bent as though the weight of 74 years had finally settled where pride could no longer hold it up. Then he whispered something so softly I almost didn't hear it. He really never trusted me. And before I could answer, Linda looked directly at him and said the words that finished what the court had begun. "I'm filing for divorce." The sound Harold made when Linda said it was not anger. Not at first. It was something softer and far more terrible. A quiet exhale as though some last invisible support inside him had finally given way. For a moment he simply stared at her. The reporters nearest the gallery doors had already lifted their phones. I could hear camera shutters beginning to click. Linda noticed too. And just like that, her panic gave way to calculation. It was almost impressive how quickly she transformed. Her shoulders straightened. Her expression settled into wounded dignity. The trembling in her hands disappeared. She looked less like a frightened woman facing federal inquiry, and more like Charleston society's tragic wronged wife preparing her public statement. If I hadn't known her so well, I might have admired it. She lifted her chin and addressed the judge in a voice smooth enough for charity galas and board luncheons. "Your Honor, I was deliberately misled regarding these transactions. Effective immediately, I will cooperate fully with all investigators and seek legal separation from Mr. Whitmore. Harold stared at her in disbelief. After 19 years of polished dinners, social climbing, and whispered reassurances in their historic South Battery home, she had abandoned him in less than 30 seconds. I suppose that was what surprised him most. Not that she would leave. That she would leave first. He gave a dry, humorless laugh. You always were efficient. Linda didn't answer. She simply turned and walked toward the courtroom doors, heels clicking sharply across the hardwood floor each step, carrying her farther from the life she had built beside him. No backward glance, no hesitation. When the heavy doors shut behind her, the sound echoed through the chamber like the closing of a vault. And Harold Whitmore was alone. The newspapers had a field day. Charleston still pretends it's above scandal, but the city feeds on it the way old gardens feed on rain. Quietly. Constantly. The Post and Courier ran the headline the next morning. Whitmore fortune frozen in federal trust shakeup. By noon, local television stations were replaying footage of Harold leaving court under federal escort. His face looked smaller on screen somehow. Not diminished by age. Diminished by exposure. The man Charleston had spent 40 years admiring had become exactly what society fears most. Ordinary. I spent that first week in Granddaddy's old office on Meeting Street, reviewing records with Auditor Dorsey and a team of forensic accountants. The office hadn't changed much since Samuel's death. Same dark oak shelves, same brass reading lamp, same faint smell of old leather and pipe tobacco trapped deep in the walls. Sitting behind his desk felt strange at first, like wearing someone else's coat. Too heavy, too large. But gradually something settled into place. Not ownership. Responsibility, that was what Granddaddy had intended all along. Auditor Dorsey stood by the window one evening reviewing spreadsheets while Charleston's harbor lights flickered beyond the glass. We've confirmed over 11 million in concealed exposure, she said. I rubbed my eyes. Can the company survive? She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at me carefully. With the right leadership, yes. I almost laughed. Leadership. It sounded absurd attached to me. A part-time librarian living in a 600-square-foot apartment above a hardware store. A widow who clipped coupons and drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dented rear bumper. I must have smiled at the irony because Dorsey tilted her head. What? I don't look like anyone's idea of corporate leadership. She gave me a long, measuring look. Then she said something I never forgot. The people most suited to power are usually the ones least interested in possessing it. It sounded exactly like something Granddaddy would have said. And somehow hearing it from a federal auditor with tired eyes and practical shoes made it even truer. The first time I addressed the Whitmore Holdings staff, nearly 300 employees filled the main production floor of Plant Number 3. The same mill Granddaddy had taken me to as a little girl. The same thunder of machinery, the same scent of cotton and oil. Most of the workers looked wary. They had spent years under Harold's polished promises and aggressive expansion speeches. They expected another executive performance. Instead, I stood on the loading platform in my plain gray blazer and told them the truth. The company is carrying serious hidden debt. A murmur rippled through the room. I let it settle. Then I continued. There will be changes. Executive bonuses are suspended immediately. Luxury development exposure is being liquidated. Debt restructuring begins next week. A few grim faces nodded. They had heard enough corporate language to know layoffs usually followed. I took a breath. No hourly workers will lose pension protection under my authority. The room stilled. Several people looked up sharply. An older machinist near the front folded his arms. How can you promise that? His name tag read Earl Harrison. And suddenly I remembered him. The same Earl Granddaddy had greeted by name 40 years earlier. I smiled. Because your wife had bypass surgery in 1986, and Granddaddy personally covered your deductible after your insurance denied the claim. Earl's expression changed. You remember that? I remember him remembering. Silence. Then Earl gave one slow nod. That nod changed everything. Trust doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives quietly, one honest recognition at a time. By the end of the meeting, people were listening differently. Not to a Whitmore heir. To a steward. Exactly as Granddaddy intended. Harold, meanwhile, moved into a modest assisted living apartment on the west side of Charleston. Not because he was infirm. Because nearly every account he controlled had been frozen pending review, and the South Battery house was under temporary trust possession. Charleston's social circles moved on quickly. The invitations stopped. The golf club board regretfully accepted his resignation. Friends he'd entertained for decades suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts. That's another thing age teaches, I suppose. Some relationships are simply transactions wearing smiles. He had built his entire life among people who loved status more than substance. Once status vanished, so did they. The irony would have amused Granddaddy, if it weren't so sad. I arranged anonymous monthly payments to cover Harold's apartment. Nothing extravagant, just enough. When Auditor Dorsey discovered it, she frowned. What? I looked out the office window toward Charleston Harbor, where evening sunlight scattered gold across the water. Because he's still my father. She studied me for a moment, then nodded once. No judgment, just understanding. I thought that would be the end of it. A quiet mercy he'd never know about. But 3 months later, my office phone rang just after lunch. I answered absently, still reviewing pension restructuring proposals. A long silence greeted me. Then Harold's voice came softly across the line. Why are you paying my rent? My chest tightened. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I had never once heard from him in 46 years. I need to see you. And for reasons I couldn't quite explain. I said yes. I drove to his apartment on a Thursday afternoon in late October. Charleston was caught in that brief, perfect season when the summer heat finally loosens its grip and the city remembers how to breathe. The oak trees along Broad Street still held most of their leaves, their branches draped in Spanish moss that shifted softly in the breeze like old lace curtains. I parked my Honda in front of the assisted living complex and sat for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. The building itself was clean but unremarkable. 3 stories of beige brick and white trim tucked beside a Methodist church and a small pharmacy. Nothing like the South Battery mansion Harold had ruled for nearly 2 decades. No wrought iron balconies. No harbor view. No gleaming black town car waiting by the curb. Just a quiet, ordinary place where old men played checkers in the lobby and women tended potted geraniums near the entrance. For some reason that comforted me. Pride has trouble breathing in ordinary places. I found his apartment on the 2nd floor. Unit 214. The brass numbers were slightly crooked. I stood there longer than necessary, my hand hovering over the door. 46 years of complicated history can gather itself into a single knock. When I finally raised my hand, the sound felt louder than it should have. A few seconds later, the door opened, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. Not because age had changed him. Age had always touched him lightly. Even at 74, Harold Whitmore still carried traces of the broad-shouldered man Charleston once admired. Number. What startled me was the absence of performance. He wore a plain blue cardigan over a white undershirt and khaki slacks that had clearly not been pressed. His silver hair was thinner than I remembered. He had missed a spot shaving near his jaw. There was no polished smile, no executive confidence, no carefully arranged posture designed to command a room. He simply looked like an old man who had answered his own door. And somehow that made my throat tighten. Hello, Evelyn. His voice was quieter, too. I nodded. Hello, Father. He stepped aside. The apartment was modest but tidy. A narrow sofa faced a television that wasn't turned on. A bookshelf stood against one wall, half filled with biographies and financial magazines. A small dining table held 2 coffee cups and a plate of untouched sugar cookies. The curtains were open. Late afternoon sunlight spilled across the carpet in long golden bars. He had prepared for my visit. That realization hurt more than I expected. He motioned toward the sofa. Would you like coffee? I almost smiled. For as long as I could remember, Harold Whitmore had never made his own coffee. Yes, I said. He disappeared into the kitchenette. I could hear the awkward clatter of ceramic cups, the hiss of an inexpensive drip machine. When he returned, he handed me a mug and sat carefully across from me. For a while, neither of us spoke. We simply held our coffee and listened to the faint sounds of traffic outside. Then he looked down at his hands and said very quietly, "You always took it black." I blinked. The comment was so small, so unexpectedly observant that for a second I didn't know how to answer. Yes. He nodded faintly. Another silence. Then he said the words I had stopped expecting years ago. I'm sorry. The air seemed to shift around us. I had imagined hearing those words countless times over the years. Sometimes in anger, sometimes in triumph, sometimes in dreams so vivid they left me aching after I woke. But now that they had finally arrived, they didn't feel dramatic. They felt fragile, like something too easily broken by the wrong response. I set my coffee down carefully. For what? He gave a sad little laugh. That's a fair question. His hands folded together, fingers trembling slightly. Then he looked at me directly. And for the first time in my life, Harold Whitmore spoke to me without armor. When your mother died, he said I didn't know how to be anyone else. I frowned. He stared at the floor. My entire life was spent trying to earn your grandfather's respect. Every promotion, every expansion, every public success, I thought eventually he would look at me and say, I was enough. His voice caught, but he never did. I thought of Granddaddy's steady eyes, his quiet standards, his belief that character mattered more than applause. And suddenly I understood something I had never allowed myself to consider. Samuel hadn't withheld love from Harold. He had withheld approval Harold believed he was owed. There's a difference, a painful one. Father rubbed his thumb across his palm the way nervous men do. When he trusted you instead of me? He swallowed hard. I couldn't bear it. The confession hung between us. Simple, ugly, honest. So much damage born from one wounded son's hunger to be chosen. I told myself you were weak because admitting otherwise meant admitting why he trusted you. He looked up, his eyes wet now. And then Michael got sick. I felt my chest tighten. His voice dropped lower. You loved him the way your mother loved me, completely, without bargaining for worth. He shook his head. I envied that. The room blurred slightly as tears gathered in my eyes. For years I had carried my own bitterness like polished stone. Heavy but familiar. Now sitting across from this smaller, broken version of my father, I felt it begin to loosen. Not vanish, but soften. I drew a slow breath. When Michael died, I said quietly, I thought losing him meant losing the only person who ever really saw me. Father's face crumpled. And then something extraordinary happened. Harold Whitmore began to cry. Not politely, not with restrained dignity. He wept openly, shoulders shaking, all the carefully controlled grief of a lifetime breaking loose in that small beige apartment. I moved before thinking, crossed the space between us, and sat beside him. For a moment, neither of us knew what to do. Then his hand found mine. Small things can heal what grand gestures never touch. We sat like that for a long time. Two grieving people at last honest enough to mourn what pride had stolen. Eventually his breathing steadied. He wiped his face and stared out the window at the fading Charleston light. I thought success meant never needing anyone, he whispered. I squeezed his hand gently. No, I said. It means becoming someone safe enough to be needed. He turned to me slowly. And there, for the first time in 46 years, I saw it. Not judgment. Not disappointment. Not calculation. Recognition. As if he were finally seeing the daughter who had been standing in front of him all along. His voice was barely audible. Your grandfather chose wisely. And for the first time since I was a little girl, I believed he meant it. A year later, Charleston looked the same. That was the funny thing about old southern cities. They know how to keep their face composed while everything underneath quietly changes. The church bells still rang across Broad Street on Sunday mornings. Tourists still wandered the Battery taking photographs of historic homes they could never afford. The harbor still caught the evening sun and scattered it across the water like handfuls of broken gold. From the outside, Whitmore Holdings still looked like what it had always been. Old money wrapped in brick and ivy. But inside everything was different. The luxury coastal developments Harold had hidden so carefully were gone. Liquidated. The debt had been restructured without sacrificing a single worker pension. Executive compensation was capped. Board seats were opened to employee representation for the first time in company history. And most importantly, the company had begun doing what Granddaddy always believed business was meant to do. Serve people instead of consuming them. Plant number 3 had reopened 2 modernized production lines. Scholarship funds had been established for workers' children and grandchildren. Charleston County libraries, some of which had struggled for years under shrinking public budgets, received permanent educational grants through the Samuel Whitmore Foundation. That part meant the most to me. There is something deeply satisfying about seeing children walk into libraries your family once helped build, and knowing those doors will remain open long after your own life is finished. Legacy should sound like turning pages, not applause. The dedication ceremony for the Samuel Whitmore Education Center was held on a cool November afternoon beneath a bright blue sky. The new building stood beside plant number 3, its clean red brick designed to match the historic mill beside it. Workers and their families filled the courtyard. Children chased each other between folding chairs while older employees shook hands and traded stories about Granddaddy. Earl Harrison stood near the front in his best suit, his wife beside him. When he saw me, he smiled and tipped his head. That small gesture still meant more to me than any boardroom vote ever could. I had just stepped toward the podium when I saw him. Harold. He stood near the back of the crowd wearing a plain charcoal suit that had clearly been altered down from better years. He looked thinner now, frail in a way he hadn't been even 12 months earlier. Age had finally caught him, perhaps because pride was no longer there to hold it at bay. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he gave me a small nod and smiled. It was not Harold Whitmore's old public smile, the polished one he wore for donors and photographers and investors. This one was quieter, uncertain, real. I smiled back. When my speech ended, there was warm applause. Not extravagant, not performative. The kind that comes from shared gratitude rather than obligation. Then, as planned, I invited Harold to the podium. A murmur moved through the crowd. Charleston still remembered scandal. People weren't sure what to expect. Neither, I suspect, was he. He walked slowly to the microphone and stood there for several seconds, looking out at the gathered families, at the children laughing near the library doors, at the workers whose pensions had survived his mistakes, at the company his father built and his daughter had saved. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough but steady. My father spent his life teaching a lesson I refused to learn. The courtyard fell silent. Harold glanced toward me, then back to the crowd. For most of my life, I believed success meant being admired. He paused. I was wrong. The wind stirred gently through the oak trees. He drew a breath. My daughter saved what I nearly destroyed because she understood something I never did. His eyes found mine again. And then he said the words I had waited half a lifetime to hear. She became the person I should have been. No one moved. No one whispered. The truth has a way of quieting everything around it. Then Earl Harrison began to clap. Slowly. Once. Twice. Then the entire courtyard joined him. Not for redemption. Not for status. For honesty. For the simple courage of finally telling the truth. When Harold stepped down, his eyes were wet. He took his seat in the front row and sat quietly through the remainder of the ceremony, one hand resting on the polished wood of his cane. Later, after the crowd had thinned and evening light stretched long across the courtyard, we sat together on a bench outside the library. Children's laughter drifted faintly from inside. The building glowed warmly through its tall windows. Harold looked at it for a long time. Then he said softly, "He would have liked this." I smiled. Yes. Another silence settled between us. But this one was peaceful. The kind of silence built from understanding instead of distance. After a while, he turned to me. "Do you think he forgave me?" I thought carefully before answering. Then I said the only honest thing I knew. "I think he always hoped you'd forgive yourself." Harold's eyes filled again. He nodded slowly and looked back toward the library. And there, beneath the fading Charleston sky with children reading inside a building built from second chances, I finally understood what my grandfather had spent his whole life trying to teach us. Wealth is not what we keep. It is what we protect for others. Pride builds empires that collapse. Character builds legacies that endure. And sometimes the truest form of revenge is not destruction. It is becoming someone kind enough to forgive. If this story stirred something in your own heart, if it reminded you of someone you've needed to forgive, or someone whose forgiveness you still hope to earn, perhaps tonight is the night to reach for that peace. And if stories like this speak to the quiet truths life teaches us with age, I hope you'll share this one with someone who might need it, and join us again. Because sometimes the stories worth hearing most are the ones that help us come home to ourselves.